Hello and welcome to this video where we'll come into architecture and resources in Azure. We'll talk about how the resources and resource groups and subscriptions are organized and how the hierarchies in Azure, and go into a few resources. So this will be interesting, and this is just a theoretical intuition video. So we'll go into Keynote now. So here I'm in Keynote, so architecture and resources level in Azure. So there are different levels. So let's look into this. So we have different levels of resources in Azure. So we start with the top group, with the management group, and this is only applicable for larger organizations, as in larger organizations you can divide into several subscriptions. And for example, different teams could have different subscriptions, or different departments could have subscriptions, or it could be project-based. And the idea is that you're billed on the subscription level. And as you can see here, you have, for example, subscription marketing and subscription engineering and subscription IT, and it's billed. So this is a billing unit. So all resources are billed to its subscription. Then how much costs the IT subscription, the IT department has incurred in Azure, and how much cost the engineering department has incurred, etc., or per project based, as depends on how the company want to divide it. So let's see, and in each subscription you have several resource groups, and the resource groups are basically logical containers for the resources. So you have several resources that are tied to each resource group. So that is how it works. Here you have different amount of resource groups in different subscriptions, and you can also work with roles inside of a subscription. So you can give different tenants different types of roles. Okay, so let's move on. When you create a personal account, you have one subscription. So this is what it looks like. You have a subscription. So it could be like you have a Azure for Students subscription. It could be that you have a free subscription. It could be that you have a pay-as-you-go subscription, depending on what type of account you create, etc. And then inside of subscription, you have several resource groups, and inside of the resource groups, you have several resources. So all resources are billed to your credit card if you use pay-as-you-go model. And resource groups are logical grouping of the resources. So basically all the resources that fit together, for example, for a virtual machine. So the virtual machine itself, it cannot work because it requires a networking, it requires a disk, etc. So all these should be grouped together in a resource group. That is how it works. And the thing is, in the resource group, when you delete a resource group, it will delete all its resources. So when you're doing different tutorials with me, for example, you just want to do it to see that you can spin up different resources, and then you can tear them down just by deleting the resource group, so that it doesn't incur any costs when they are idle. So when you're not using it for any purpose. And then we come into resource. It's an individual service or object in Azure. So for example, a resource could be a VM, it could be Azure Functions, it could be App Service, and these are compute resources. Then we have storage resources, such as storage account and Azure disks. And then we have databases, for example, databases. We have Cosmos DB, that's Snow. We have networking, like VNet virtual networks, to connect the different types of resources together. And you can also connect to on-premise to make a hybrid cloud. And here we have NSG, with networking security group. And then you have load balancer for when you have several VMs, you need to balance the load. And then for security, you have, for example, Key Vault and Microsoft to create the roles and permissions, IAM basically. And we go into, for example, we talk a little bit about the role-based access control, called RBAC, abbreviation, to control who gets access to what resources. So this is very important. You don't give access to everyone, because that is a security risk. What you should do is that some people should get just enough access. So there's something called IAM, Identity Access Management. And for doing this, we get who can do what in Azure, and this is very important. So we assign roles to users, groups, and apps so that depending on which role they have, they get different access levels. Here we talk about something called Principle of Least Privilege, POLP. This is a very important principle. And also zero trust. I haven't written it down here, but you should never trust anyone. Instead, you should verify. However, principle of least privilege means that you should only get enough privilege to do your work and nothing more. For example, an organization that gives admin access to anyone so that it's very easy for them to work with anything, that is super bad practice. You should reduce risk of unauthorized access, and this will protect sensitive data. And then we'll talk about different availability zones in Azure. And we have Azure regions. For example, we have Azure regions, and inside those we have zones. And these data centers have independent power, cooling, and networking so that we can increase the uptime, we can increase the resilience. If you're doing on-premise, for example, your facility burns down or there's a power outage, how will you keep the uptime? How will you keep resilience? Do you have backup? And all these things are covered in Azure. For example, they have data centers with different power, cooling, and networking. If there's a power outage, they have backup generators within those data centers. And if that goes off, then they mirror your data into another zone with independent power, cooling, and networking, which means that you still have your uptime. In this way, your web app, for example, won't go down so that your customer can still enjoy your app, even if there's a major outage. And what Azure guarantees is that they guarantee a certain amount of uptime that is like 99.99 and maybe another 9 also if you add, depending on how you configure the resources, etc. But note that by having this amount of uptime means that it's like a few minutes or a few seconds per year that your app is not working or your resources are not up. And note that this is very hard to get when you're using your own data centers. Okay. Yes, in this video you have seen some introduction to Azure architecture and resources and different resource levels, starting with the management group down to subscription level and then down to resource groups, and talked a little bit about how the billing worked and then going into different types of resources that exists. In this course, we won't touch upon all the resources, but some of them. And also we have talked about role-based access control, RBAC, in order to give roles to different users and groups and apps so that we get who can do what in Azure. And then talked a little bit about availability zones, which makes sure that we get the uptime and resilience and redundancy that exists using Azure. With this, I hope that you've gotten some intuition about some fundamentals in Azure. And thank you for watching this video and see you in the next one. Bye.